without further ado, it's my pleasure now to introduce Mrs. Murianti, Chair of PFPWG, to give the welcome address. Mrs. Murianti, please.
President of Asian Food and Beverage Alliance, distinguished speakers and participants from Asian member states, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the workshop of facilitation of import and export activities through mutual recognition of food safety control systems. This is the third meeting that has been held by AFBA in cooperation with Asian Consultative Committee on Standard and Quality, Prepared Foodstuff Product Working Group. On behalf of PFPWG, I would like to convey my appreciation and sincere thanks to AFBA for continued support to PFPWG. Ladies and gentlemen, in response to the rising protectionism globally, ASEAN, as a region with growing economic prominence, continues to deepen and strengthen its economic integration agenda through continuous work towards the goals of doubling intra-ASEAN trade between 2017 with amount 590 billion USD to 1,180 billion USD in 2025, as mentioned at the Asian Economic Community Blueprint 2025, as well as to improve member states' performance in global rankings such as World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report or World Bank Ease of Doing Business. In past years, there has been a significant increase in the quantity and variety of food distribution in international trade. The contributing factors, namely the expanding world economy, the liberalization in food trade, the growing consumer demand, as well as developments in the food science, technology, transport, and communication sectors. Due to the factors mentioned above, food safety concern within international trade is rising. Therefore, it is important for Asian region both to ensure the protection of consumers' health and facilitate sustainable, safe food supply. Distinguished participants, with regard to the MRA on PF Annex 3, detailed in Asian Principle for Food Import and Export Inspection and Certification, this workshop could be very worthwhile to ensure the implementation of mutual recognition of food control system in the ASEAN, not only for the authorities as well as private sector. Last but not least, I wish this workshop a great success and all of you are in a good health, as well as staying healthy during this period of pandemic. Thank you for your kind attention. May God bless us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Murianti, for that welcome address. Due to some circumstances, Mr. Chung Eun-tiong won't be able to make it for today's workshop. Yep, so I'll hand over the time to Teresa, who will just give a rough introduction of the workshop today.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, and apologies again to our participants today on behalf of Mr. Chung, as he has some last-minute matters, and I'll be delivering the introduction on his behalf. So first of all, good afternoon to the chair of the ASEAN Prepared Foodstuff Product Working Group, Mrs. Murianti Punjuan Pintaria, fellow speakers, PFPWG delegates, ASEAN Secretariat, and also our fellow regulators and industry members from ASEAN member states who are with us today. It's an honor to be able to be with you this afternoon. And first of all, we would like to thank PFPWG for this opportunity for the ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance to have this workshop. AFBA was established in 2013 with the aim to support harmonization efforts across Southeast Asia, and we aim to provide a voice for the food industry, and we seek to coordinate industry efforts to deliver effective input and practical guidance on ASEAN policies to unlock the sector's growth potential in and out of the region. And as the region recovers from the effects of the pandemic, it is important to ensure that ongoing efforts lead towards building a more dynamic and resilient ASEAN, capable of responding and adapting to various challenges through robust national and regional mechanisms to overcome various issues, including those pertaining to the food sector. And to achieve this, a fine balance between food safety and economic openness is needed to increase trade of food and agricultural products. And moving the region towards an effective and uniform food safety approach has always been a matter of great priority for ASEAN. And in this regard, the work under PFPWG is critical. The workshop this year is themed as Facilitation of Import and Export Activities through Mutual Recognition of Food Safety Control Systems, with a strong link to the ongoing implementation of the ASEAN sectoral MRA for inspection and certification systems on food hygiene for prepared foodstuff products, which encompasses food import and exports inspection and certification. And in this workshop, we aim to build a common understanding on the implementation of mutual recognition on inspection and certification of prepared food products. The benefits of mutual recognition agreements are evident, notably reduced costs, greater certainty of market access, increased competition, and freer flow of trade. And as the food industry has demonstrated its resilience over the 2 years of pandemic, we recognize this would only be possible with the leadership and coordination from food authorities and other related ministerial bodies across ASEAN in working with industry members and overseas counterparts to ensure the continuation of production, provision, and distribution of food and beverages. As the food industry remains committed to ensure the continuous running of the food supply chain, we support efforts from government authorities in exploring ways to make use of, improve, and expand existing trade facilitative mechanisms in line with the spirit of ASEAN regionalism. I'm grateful for the speaker from Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment who is with us today to share about their experiences, including recognition arrangement, management of food safety risk, and official controls on imported food. I do believe that the sharing will be beneficial to the participants to understand the mechanism to build mutual recognition in other regions, as well as implementation of food safety controls during import and export activities. And lastly, I would like to express my appreciation to Malaysia as the chair of the Joint Sectoral Committee on MRA on Prepared Foodstuff, as well as GAPMI as the industry representative who would be speaking at the panel discussion which focuses on the MRA on prepared food, its implementation, and the opportunities that it brings to ASEAN member states, as well as the roles of public and private sectors in achieving greater coordination to ensure a consistent implementation at national and regional levels. So I look forward to a fruitful interaction and exchange of ideas with our participants here today. Thank you, and back to you, Justin.
Thank you, Ms. Teresa. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Ms. Tanya Martin, Director of Imported Food at the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Ms. Tanya will be sharing with us more on the management of food safety risks for Australia imported food before we move on for a time of Q&A after the presentation. Over to you, Ms. Tanya.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you also for Teresa, who approached this department and gave us the opportunity to talk at this workshop. So I'm the Director for Imported Food, and I've been with the department for coming up to 7 years. And prior to that, I worked for Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, who I'll be mentioning in this presentation. Thank you. Next slide. So today I'm going to talk about how Australia goes about managing food safety risks with food being imported into Australia. And we do this through what we call our Imported Food Inspection Scheme. I'll also talk about foreign government certification arrangements. So we have mandatory arrangements and also voluntary. And I'll just go into a little bit about how we assess equivalence and negotiate certification arrangements for those certification arrangements. And Teresa also asked me just to mention the arrangement that we have with New Zealand in relation to mutual recognition. Next. So if I just start with how we manage food risks. So Australia's food regulatory system is reasonably complex, so there's quite a lot of players. So this slide just gives a bit of an overview. So Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, which I did mention previously, I did work there for quite a long time. So it's an Australian government statutory authority, and New Zealand is part of that joint regulatory system, but it is an Australian government authority. So it has responsibility for developing food standards in Australia and also for New Zealand as well. And importantly for me, FSANZ provides imported food risk advice. So I'll go into that into a bit more detail later. And it coordinates food recalls and incidents. So we work with FSANZ when we have incidents involving imported food. So the Australian, I should say that FSANZ sits under the portfolio of the Australian Government Department of Health, and the Department of Health has overarching responsibility for food policy and also for coordinating foodborne illness surveillance with the states and territories. So down on the left is us. We're at the border, and where, as I said, we run an imported food inspection scheme to verify compliance with imported food, and we also have to take responsibility when things aren't going well, and we need to put in place some arrangements to manage incidents with imported food. So that's us at the border, but post-border, the state and territory food regulators are responsible for regulating food that's actually for sale in Australia. So that's food that's domestically produced, but also food that's imported. And obviously they're involved in incident response activities for domestic produced food as well. Next. So imported food, there is a shared responsibility between government, but also the food industry and overseas regulators as well. So in terms of imported food, before food comes into the country, you know, we are expecting the producers in the exporting countries to be producing that food safely and ensuring that if it's being exported to Australia, that it meets our requirements. And we also have expectations on the competent authority that has responsibility for those producers to make sure that the food is safe and compliant. At the border, we obviously want importers to make sure that they're sourcing from reputable suppliers and they're aware of all their obligations, and then of course we will do the checking. And then post-border, the states and territories, as I mentioned, are also checking with the food importers that the food is safe and compliant. Next. So in terms of the legislation that we're administering, the department has responsibility not only for food safety, but also for managing biosecurity risks. So the department, in terms of food and all goods coming into the country, manages that through the Biosecurity Act. So with respect to food, some foods do pose a biosecurity risk, and that piece of legislation needs to be complied with first. So you must meet biosecurity requirements before we start checking it in terms of safety and compliance with food standards. So if a particular food passes our biosecurity checks, then if it's being referred to the Imported Food Inspection Scheme, then it will come to us. So the Imported Food Control Act sets out all our legal powers, and then we have subordinate legislation. So the Imported Food Control Regulations, which it goes into detail about our Imported Food Inspection Scheme. And then we have the Imported Food Control Order, and that's where you can find all the foods that we've risk listed and also the foods that require certification. Next. So the Imported Food Inspection Scheme is a risk-based scheme, and under this scheme we do classify food as risk, and if it isn't classified as risk, it's surveillance. Next. So as I mentioned before, Food Standards Australia New Zealand provides us with risk advice on imported food. So we request that advice and work with FSANZ in obtaining that advice. And then we determine what risk management we're going to put in place to manage the identified risks. FSANZ does publish, sorry if we can go back to that slide. FSANZ does publish its imported food risk statements. I haven't put the link in there, but they are available on the FSANZ website, and you can just Google FSANZ, or you can probably just Google FSANZ and imported food risk statements, and that page will come up. So that's just an example of some advice on raw beef and beef products. Next. So once we've received that advice from FSANZ, then we need to determine how we're going to manage the identified risks. So depending on the degree of risk, we have various what we call risk management tools, if you like. So the bottom risk management activity that we do at the border is just a 5% testing of surveillance food. So every consignment of surveillance food that comes into Australia has a 1 in 20 chance of being referred to our Imported Food Inspection Scheme for an inspection. So that'll be a label and visual check, and there may also be analytical tests. If FSANZ determines that a food poses a medium or high risk to public health, then we will classify that food as risk, and we will then apply some specific tests to that risk food. We can also mandate food safety management certificates, so that's third-party certification. And at the moment, the only foods requiring food safety management certificates are minimally processed berries and pomegranate arils, and that'll be mandated in November this year. We can also mandate government certification, and I'll provide more details on that later. And so we do have certain foods that must come in under government certification. And we require mandatory government certification where either the risk is very serious or we are dependent on the competent authority in the exporting country having oversight of the production or processing of that food to assure us of the safety. And then if things don't go well, we do have a range of emergency powers as well to stop food coming into the country and to seek assurances from the exporting country that any additional exports of a particular food will be the assurance and the safety of that food if it's been associated with, for example, foodborne illness. Next. So here's a list of the foods that we currently classify as risk. Now this does change, so this is just an indicative list, an indicative list of tests, but if you want to get up-to-date information, then everything's published on our website, so you're welcome to go and have a look at all the tests that apply to food coming into Australia. Next. So in terms of the imported food inspection scheme, as I mentioned, surveillance food, if it's not risk food, it's surveillance food, and if you're a surveillance food, then you have a 1 in 20 chance of being referred. But with risk food, because we're obviously trying to manage identified risks, then the food will be initially referred at the rate of 100%. And if compliance is demonstrated, then after 25 consecutive passes, then it will go down to 5%. But there's also the interim drop to 25% after 5 consecutive passes. So that just illustrates how if you can demonstrate compliance, you will gradually decrease down to the 5%. However, if you fail, then it's a return to 100%, and then you start again. So then you'll need another 5 to get down to 25, or 25 to get down to 5%. With surveillance food, if that fails, then the next 5 consignments will be referred until compliance is demonstrated. So it's 5 to 100, and then risk also will return to 100 with any fail. Next. So our foreign government certification arrangements, I'll just go through the mandatory and the voluntary. Next. So we can enter into government-to-government arrangements. And when we do this, whether it's voluntary or mandatory, we will assess the exporting country's regulatory systems to determine if they achieve an equivalent food safety outcome to Australia's. And if we do find equivalence, then we will negotiate certification. So some risk food must be covered by a foreign government certification arrangement, but countries can also opt to enter into a voluntary arrangement. And this only pertains to risk food. And if they do, this will lower border intervention. I just want to be clear, though, that any certification arrangement that covers food safety doesn't cover biosecurity. So they would be, any biosecurity requirements are additional. Next. So the benefits of a voluntary certification arrangement can best be illustrated by returning to this slide and just saying that if you have a voluntary arrangement, basically your food will be considered as per a surveillance food. So instead of being initially referred at 100%, it will be initially referred at 5%. So that's a considerable benefit, because yes, you are starting at 5 instead of 100%. And also, if you do fail and go to 100%, you only need normally 5 consecutive passes to return down to the 5%. Next. So what's our process for negotiating foreign government certification arrangements? So if it's mandatory, then we will approach countries to explain that to the competent authority. We will let the competent authority know through our agricultural counsellors that requirements are mandatory and that we need to begin the process to negotiate these arrangements. But if it's voluntary, then the competent authority needs to apply to us, and so we can have those initial discussions. If we're going to proceed, then we'll send a questionnaire to the relevant competent authority, asking for information about the regulatory systems and oversight that are in place in the country for the specific food for that has to be covered under foreign government certification, or if it's a voluntary arrangement, the foods that the countries are seeking to have under certification arrangements. So that questionnaire process can take a while, particularly if we need to seek clarifying information. But once we've got all the information that we need, we'll then do a side-to-side assessment to determine if an equivalent food safety outcome can be found. And we'll go back to the country to make sure that, you know, we've done that assessment correctly. So there is quite a lot of toing and froing. But once we've got that equivalence assessment process sorted under step 2, then under step 3, then we move to actually negotiating the specific terms of the arrangement and the certificate and what attestations we're seeking on that certificate. So, I mean, even though I've only put 3 steps here, this process can take quite a long time, and sometimes even a couple of years. So it's not a simple process. It can be quite a lengthy process and a lot of toing and froing between us and the competent authority in the exporting country. Next. So in terms of mandatory certifications, there's not a lot of foods that we require mandatory certification. So raw milk, beef and beef products, human milk and human milk products. And then from November next, actually, it should be 2023, sorry, from November 2023, bivalve mollusks and bivalve mollusk products. So where certification is mandatory, foods that don't have these arrangements in place are not permitted to come into the country. Next. In terms of voluntary arrangements, we have voluntary arrangements in place with Thailand and Canada, and these arrangements are for risk seafood. And as I mentioned, these foods do come into the country under a reduced rate of inspection and testing. Next. So now just briefly talk about the arrangements that we have with New Zealand. So in 1996, the 2 governments of Australia and New Zealand agreed that all goods, so not just food, but actually everything that was being traded between the 2 countries, basically could be sold in the other country provided it met that country's legal requirements. So that meant anything that could be legally sold in New Zealand could be exported to Australia and sold here, and likewise anything in Australia that met Australia's requirements could be exported to New Zealand. So, I mean, it's essentially free trade between the 2 countries. So once the governments made that agreement, the principles were enacted through a piece of legislation called the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Act. So because it applied to everything, including food, then our Imported Food Control Act was amended to specifically exempt food that is imported from New Zealand. So all food imported, well, most food imported from New Zealand is not referred to our Imported Food Inspection Scheme, and we don't inspect and test it. However, we do have the ability to take foods out of that exemption And we do that where regulatory approaches are not consistent. So there's only 4 types of foods that don't receive that exemption. So it's beef products, ready-to-eat cassava chips and brown seaweed. So the reasons for that are New Zealand in relation to managing risks with BSE, so bovine spongiform encephalitis, took a different approach to Australia, and hence why beef and beef products are not exempted. And likewise, there were incidents in Australia with cassava and also with brown seaweed. So Australia put in place some specific requirements to manage identified risks following those incidents, and New Zealand opted not to adopt those specific requirements. So hence they are not exempted. Next. So because we basically have free trade between the 2 countries, we have developed a joint food regulatory system with New Zealand, because if we're going to accept each other's food, then it makes sense that we have the same regulatory requirements. So hence Australia's Standard Setting Agency, which is now called Food Standards Australia New Zealand, became a joint food standards setting agency. So New Zealand is part of that standard setting system, and we try our best to make sure that we have the same requirements. As I said, it doesn't always work 100% of the time, so not all the standards are completely identical, but generally most of the standards are uniform across those 2 countries. Next. So, yeah, that finishes my presentation. Please visit our website if you want more information, and also you can subscribe to be alerted to any changes to how we're inspecting and testing imported food that's being imported into Australia. And happy to take questions. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Ms. Tanya, for the insightful sharing regarding the various approaches in Australia, such as the imported food risk statements, management tools, and certificates. Now we'll move on to the time of a Q&A, and next 5 minutes or so. For those who may want to raise questions, you may use the raise hand feature, and the organizer will unmute your mic. Either that, you can also drop the questions via the chat box. Yep, so I guess now it's open to the floor, whoever wants to raise any questions.
Hi, Ms. Tanya. I'm Zhe-Ling from FIA. So I actually have a question regarding the trans-trauma MRA. So I think the benefits are quite clear, but is there any particular challenges in the process of developing the joint food standards between Australia and New Zealand?
Look, that's a very good question. I was actually at the then National Food Authority, so that predated FSANZ before Australia joined. And yes, it was not a simple process to become a joint food regulatory system, and did require changes to legislation both in Australia and New Zealand. So obviously the National Food Authority became a New Zealand, was incorporated into the name, and then also we needed to make changes to the Act. So there is the FSANZ Act, and so that was amended, and then obviously in New Zealand they needed to make quite a lot of changes. So look, it took some years to bring this joint food regulatory system into place. So yeah, not simple, but certainly worth it, because obviously both countries greatly benefit from the free trade going between the two countries.
Just want to check if there's any more questions that anyone would like to raise. Okay, if there's no further question, probably you can move on to the next part of today's workshop. Thanks, Ms. Tanya, once again. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Teresa Loh, speaker from AFBA, to share with us the industry perspective on a topic, in particular on supply chain linkages within the region. Over to you, Teresa.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Justin. And a very good afternoon again to our participants today. And today, I will look at this topic from a more macro level, and I'll offer some industry perspective with regards to how we view the changes in food supply chain, and especially in the region here in ASEAN. Next slide. And before that, I'll just do a very quick introduction about AFBA. And Rachel, just click one more time so that we can show who are the members of AFBA. So these are the national associations that are currently under AFBA, which is a short form for ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance. And in terms of our vision and mission, it's really to support harmonization efforts across the region. And we seek to provide a voice for the food industry, even as we also hope that we can move the sector as a whole towards greater potential in and out of the region. Next slide. And today I would speak on this topic from mainly three aspects. Firstly, on the existing opportunities in economic cooperation, and then also the ways for the benefits from these economic cooperations to be maximized. And secondly, the supply chain volatility that the industry is facing currently, as well as the impact to the supply chain, and hence why building supply chain linkages is so important. And last but not least, other new emerging areas that we have seen in the food industry which calls for the need to build greater regulatory resilience. Next slide. So on the first part, I would dwell a bit more on RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which we are all familiar with, where even though it was just signed in 2020, but the efforts have gone like long before 2020, where it first started in 2011. So what is key of RCEP is that it's actually an integral part of the ASEAN Economic Community, which seeks to forge greater economic integration, not just within ASEAN, but globally as well. So at many levels, RCEP does contain texts and also provisions that have great potential to unlock the trade opportunities for businesses, including the food sector. And you can see here a few key areas that are mentioned in the box on the right. So as the first mega FTA for East Asia, what is different of RCEP as compared to other ASEAN +1 FTAs is that RCEP does offer a single consolidated rulebook that applies to businesses in all 15 RCEP participating countries. And beyond that, the expansion of market access for businesses and the transparency as well as predictability that comes under RCEP would help to promote businesses' confidence in diversification of sourcing and selling. And it would also be worthwhile to mention that RCEP is the first FTA where China, Japan, and Korea are part of the same FTA. Next slide. So with the signing that took place in 2020, this signaled the benefits of RCEP that would be made available for the region. And it can be summarized in these four broad areas. Firstly, the boost in trade of goods, services, and investments, and thus contributing to the continued economic developments of the region as a whole. And secondly, there are also new and advanced rules that are covered under RCEP, which are intentionally included to keep up with the current context and to remain relevant. So just a small example, it does include elements about digitalization, which is something that's relevant to the context of today. And thirdly, RCEP would facilitate the establishment of regional production networks and supply chain. Last but not least, it would also help to narrow the economic gaps between advanced and developing countries within the region. Next slide. And even as we look forward, RCEP would be a key instrument to facilitate import and export activities and further help to build that supply chain linkage in the region. And this is especially important amidst rising protectionism as well as during and in the post-pandemic era. However, for industry to tap on the full benefits under RCEP, non-tariff measures, NTMs, remain as the key aspects that needs to be addressed in parallel with the implementation of RCEP, especially for the food sector, where SPS and TBD measures can take up to 82 to 86% of the total NTMs. So while there are trade opportunities that come with the use of RCEP as well as other trade agreements, our view is that overly burdensome NTMs and the unintended effects, such as additional costs, lack of transparency and predictability, may hinder businesses from further expanding supply chain network, and thus it would limit the intended impact of such trade agreements. Next slide. So moving on to the next part of my sharing today about supply chain volatility. So I'll borrow some insight from a study that was recently launched by Food Industry Asia, FIA, and Oxford Economics, which talks about climate change and food prices. And here, just some quick data to just help to build up my sharing is that here we can see how with the rise in average temperature and also extreme weathers, data from the past has showed that such events could add as much as 6% to the producer cost of food in Southeast Asian economies. So even as countries are looking at transitioning to net zero, something that's really picking up speed in the region as well, we view that the transition itself comes with a cost of its own. So because as big changes are made to the way we generate electricity, for example, and in the study, a case study was done on Indonesia, whereby it is estimated that food prices could be as much as 80% higher in a scenario where the government achieved net zero by 2050, but does not accompany this with measures to help mitigate the cost impact to the food supply chain. And therefore, the impacts that come from these changes are important areas to be considered no matter the approach. Next slide. So even as we consider the impact from external factors, and we do see that there's a close link to food supply chain as well, such as the impact from lower crop yields, and it raises the attention for stronger food supply chain linkages around the region to help boost investments and drive competition, both of which should help to keep food prices lower. And as mentioned earlier, RCEP does provide a step in the right direction, but much more potential remains. And furthermore, extreme weather events tend to be highly localized, and therefore we view that the ability to source from alternative suppliers can help to offset interruptions to the local supply. So with that, I'll move on to the last segment, and again, riding on the earlier thought about the changing external environment, and earlier I mentioned about climate change, which itself is a broad topic. And here I would like to also highlight some of the new emerging changes in the industry that we are facing, and that would also impact the supply chain as well. So, and I think just to name a few, we do notice like a changing consumer trends, for example, a greater attention from our consumers on health and wellness, and largely due to the effects from COVID. And currently, we are also seeing a lot of innovation that's going on, new food types, processes, technologies, as well as new business models, such as the rise of food e-commerce. And on the fourth point, I've also mentioned a bit about the disruption and how we are currently experiencing a lot of changes in production network, be it due to the pandemic or due to other political conflicts. Next slide. And last year, FIE had a small-scale regulatory forum, and I think I would like to also share some of the responses that we have gathered from the pre-event survey, because I see there are some relevance in what I've mentioned earlier as well, and how it leads to the idea of building regulatory resilience. So from the participants' point of view, there were several key areas that were highlighted even as we look forward into the next few years, and how do we ensure that regulatory framework remain resilient and would be appropriate to cater to these new changes. So for example, there were mentions about the need for early identification and response to new emerging challenges, as well as the need for more data transparency. So with that, it also means that there's a need for resource sharing between our stakeholders, and also how And that includes data as well. But however, that comes along with the challenges of like some privacy issues when it, especially for data sharing, as well as how do we ensure that like global food supply chain can continue to carry on amidst the rising risks that we see in supply chain with different changes and new emerging products or technologies, and how do we ensure that these do not disrupt the food supply chain. And last but not least, we recognize that we are in a process of a lot of changes, and within this environment, how do we ensure that regulatory approach can keep pace with these changes and remain ahead, while at the same time remaining vigilant at the same time with regards to the risks that are rising. Next slide. So interestingly, in the survey, out of the few options that were given to ask our participants what would be the aspect that they consider important in ensuring food regulatory resilience, out of the responses that we received, all of the participants mentioned that agility is a important aspect, even as we think about food regulatory resilience. So moving on, next slide. So this is my final slide, and I would conclude with this chart here, whereby we are currently in this present scenario and how we are, and I mentioned about the different changes and how we are moving to a future scenario, and within this this transition, we do see that the need for both the present to complement what will be coming in the future as well. So meaning that how do we ensure that regulatory framework continue to adjust and adapt to the ongoing changes. So with that, as industry, we continue to seek for to strengthen the food supply chain in the region. We do see that having an enabling and resilient regulatory environment would help to support that overall change and transition as well. And on one hand, continuous efforts that are currently ongoing regarding regulatory reforms or elimination of non-tariff measures will still continue to be important, and this comes with partnership and also governmental commitments. While on the other hand, we do view that there needs to be a collective collective efforts to embrace future or forward-looking regulatory approach, and that would mean to develop future-proof regulatory approaches and to ensure that there can be flexible and pragmatic approach. So with that, I hope that this helps to give us an idea, a broad idea about the current status and the need for supply chain linkages to be strengthened. And while that's ongoing, what are the other things that needs to come into place for that to take place? So I thank you for your time and your attention as well. So that's all from my sharing for today. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Justin.
Thanks, Ms. Teresa. For the final session for today's workshop, I am pleased to have two speakers who will be sharing their perspectives on the facilitation of import and export activities through mutual recognition of food safety control systems. Without further delay, I will pass the time to the moderator, Dr. Shidra, Senior Food Safety and Nutrition Officer, FAO Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, to take over this session. Dr. Shidra, please.
Thank you. First of all, on behalf of FAO, I'd like to thank the AFBA for inviting us here to moderate this very interesting panel discussion we are going to have by two very notable representatives, Mrs. Noorani Ehsan, who is the chair of the Joint Sectoral Committee on MRA on PF, and she's the Director of Compliance and Industry Development at the Food Safety and Quality Division, Ministry of Health. Welcome to this panel discussion, Mrs. Noorani. And we also have Mr. Adi Lukman, who's the chairman of the Indonesian Food and Beverage Association, or the GAP MMI. So without any further ado, we will just plunge into the panel discussion. I just wanted to give you, just to set the scene and just to take a step back from what we've been discussing, and we also heard very interesting presentations from Australia as well as from AFBA. We just want to take a step back initially and then move forward with discussions. Can you just put on the slides on the... Thank you very much. So just to set the scene, what we are here discussing is on a key issue of mutual recognition of food safety control systems. So while, as we have heard both from the, especially from the example of Australia and New Zealand, even with advanced economies with very well-known and good food safety systems, there are challenges which keep emerging on actually achieving this kind of mutual recognition. So next slide. So the challenge for countries all around the world in Asia and including regional groupings like ASEAN is to ensure that the capability of different systems to meet the same objectives, which is effectively the definition of equivalence, irrespective of what system we're talking about, we're able to meet those. And I just wanted to put in context two key codex documents. I'm sure all of you are aware, and this audience does not need to be, lectured on this, but I'm sure all of you know that there are two major guidelines on the development of equivalence agreements, one on food import and export inspection certification systems, and one on sanitary measures associated with food inspection and certification. And these two actually need to be read with other documents which are on food import control systems as well as overall food control systems as well. So all these guidelines are already present and are being used extensively by countries as they start looking at some of the key issues governing mutual recognition. Next slide, please. And the aim of this, of achieving MRAs is actually to have better trade facilitation and export and import benefits to protect the health of consumers. That, of course, is the overall objective always of Codex and food safety in general, along with trade, to reduce regulatory costs for government industry. And that's how I would really like to hear from the industry representative today, how this helps. And then importantly, again, looking at it from the point of view of public health, it enables the use of convenient methods to achieve the appropriate level of protection of the important country. And therefore, harmonization of national standards and international standards and establishment of a national food safety system based on relevant codex texts actually facilitates the mutual recognition of countries' food safety system. So this is just to again put in context where all these texts can come in, where codex can help. And of course, agencies like ours, we are always working with countries in the region on these aspects. And if you look at the next slide, we have a project with the ASEAN grouping, and many of the participants who are online today have actually contributed a lot over the last almost 10 years on building capacities for effective participation in codex standard setting processes. We are currently focusing more on the very basics of standards, which is on data generation, analysis of foodborne hazards and risks. And the graphic you see here is based on what we heard from the countries on what are the key aspects or the key hazards and risks that they would like to see us assist. Okay, so I think anyway, this was the last slide, but just to talk about the capacity building project that we got now with the ASEAN grouping for effective participation in standard setting processes, for data generation, which is essentially the very basis of standard setting and therefore contributes to future objectives of MRAs and enhancing the implementation of codex documents. So I'll stop here. I think the next slide is only the thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And you see the contacts both of mine and of our coordinator for this project who can also help should you have any queries. So just to, what I'll do is just to prevent any further problems with connectivity, I will switch off my video and then I'll go to the questions to our panelists. Thank you very much. Before we start, do the panelists have anything from their, any questions, or can we just go plunge into the discussion? Okay, I don't hear any. Okay, I don't hear any, so we'll just go straight away. So let me first come to Mrs. Noorani Ehsan, who's been doing a lot of work on developing the MRA on PF. So if may I ask you first, Mrs. Ehsan, what are the areas of focus of this MRA on processed foods, and how does the scope strengthen the overall mandate of the ASEAN PPF working group? Over to you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sirdar, for the nice introduction and as our moderator today, and thanks also to AFBA for organizing this workshop. And for the first question highlighted for me, as regards to the area of focus of the MRA on PF and how does the scope strengthen the overall mandate of ASEAN PFPWG. As we know that the ASEAN sectoral mutual recognition arrangement for inspection and certification system on food hygiene for prepared foodstuff, which is MRA on PF, was signed in 27 April 2018. And it has come into force upon the signing by the ASEAN economic minister. And as we know that the objective of this sectoral MRA is to enable the mutual recognition of inspection and certification system on food hygiene with regards to the production, import and export of prepared foodstuff product in order to facilitate trade in ASEAN and protect the health of the consumer. And in this regard, the focus is specifically on the inspection and certification system on food hygiene. And this sectoral MRA set out the arrangement under which member states shall ensure that their inspection system and certification system of food hygiene are consistent with the provision of the MRA and its annexes. And as you highlighted, that we are using the annexes which is consistent with the international standard, which is based on the relevant codex text, which are there are 6 annexes, which is one of them is principle and guideline for national food control system, guideline for the general principle of food hygiene, principle for food import and export inspection and certification, guideline for the design, operation, assessment and accreditation of food import and export inspection and certification system. And the 5th one is the guideline for food import control system, and also the last one is the guideline for the exchange of information between countries on rejection of imported food. And just to share with the participant here that this MRA applies to all prepared foodstuff product under the purview of PFPWG from HS code 16 to 22. And this implementation of this MRA will create multilateral recognition that hopefully will facilitate free flow of prepared foodstuff product in ASEAN, of which can facilitate the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint meets its goal. And this is also in line with the PFPWG mandate, which is to assist the ACCSQ in addressing the elimination of the technical barrier to trade for prepared foodstuff through various initiatives, including development, implementation, and monitoring the sectoral MRA, and also to cooperate with the ASEAN Dialogue partner and private to support the implementation of the PFPWG work plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ehsan, for giving us that excellent overview on the focus of the MRA and how it strengthens the mandate. So if I now turn to Mr. Lukman. So we heard from effectively the regulators. So how do you see the current inspection or certification processes for prepared foodstuff products? And how do you think that this MRA would benefit the food businesses from your point of view? Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sridhar, as a moderator, and also thank you for AFBA for organizing this event. This is very important event because we need to make our trade among the ASEAN member states become smooth and also develop the trade and investment as well. And unfortunately, we understand that many of the countries still not in the same level of the food safety implementation. As we know, besides the non-tariff measures, we have also facing the problem with with tariff among the ASEAN member states. And regarding the non-tariff measures, we also still remain many different inspection system among the ASEAN member states countries. Some countries implement the pre-market registration, some countries no. And this is also some registration process takes a long time and also lead uncertainties to business that make impact to the exporting goods to other countries. Non-tariff measures also affect procedures also to the importers and also exporters, increasing the compliance and procedural costs as well. So that's why such costs can be increased by both the differing requirements of the varying importing markets and also different standard and technical regulation imposed by the importing countries. On the import side, sanitary and phytosanitary measures make up the largest component of the non-tariff measures, accounting for about half of the total measures. And also, cross-border trade costs tend to increase with the proliferations on non-tariff measures. The rise of SPS measures and others market access conditions reflect difference across countries. So therefore, it is important to address this difference through a common set of principles. We understand that safety and standard is very important for the food trade, but we need more facilitations for better conditions so that we can do a trade among the ASEAN member states become more smooth and also in a good condition. So this is the current situation. So I think with the MRA, I think it's much what we are focusing for the MRA. The goals of for the MRA and in the food trade is the expansion of or enhance our market access and also to consumer acceptance and also fulfillment the regulations. So this is very important. So I think with the MRA for inspection and certification system on the food hygiene is very important to be implemented among the ASEAN countries to support the smooth food trade among us. Thank you, Dr. Sudhir.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Lukman. So I think a few very important points there, including on the importance of having a common sense approach and to see how many countries can bring together and address their gaps. So it's on that question which I would like to return to Ms. Noorani, that how are ASEAN member countries, including yours, Malaysia, taking active steps to work towards the implementation of this MRA? And given that in ASEAN itself, within the countries, there are gaps across the parties. So when establishing mutual recognition, what would be your key areas for considerations for these gaps, and how would you want to bridge them? If I need to repeat, let me know, but please go ahead. Mr.
Thank you, Dr. Sudhir. And I think as highlighted by Mr. Adi just now, that we take note that there are a different level of development among the ASEAN member states as regard to the food control system. So I think a mutual recognition is one of the ways that we hope that can reduce the gap. And upon the signing of the MRA on PF, Joint Sectoral Committee on MRA for Inspection and Certification System of Food Hygiene or JSC MRA on PF was established by the all 10 ASEAN member states, and this JSC is responsible for the effective functioning of this MRA. And currently, I'm the chair of this JSC, and this JSC is comprised of the official representative designated by each member state. And the objective of this JSC is to ensure the effective implementation of this MRA. And in this JSC MRA on PF, we are working based on agreed action plan towards the implementation of the MRA on PF. And this work plan is reviewed twice a year. Only unfortunately that due to the pandemic, there have been some delay. Nevertheless, I think we are now back on track. And this JSC also established the requirement, the rules, and the procedure for the MRA. And since this is the first MRA in ASEAN related to food safety, I can see that AMS may need longer time to prepare themselves for the readiness. However, all AMS have started conducting their gap analysis against the requirement under the MRA on PF since 2020. And some member states are doing it by self-analysis, and some of them have engaged with the ARISE Plus. And in general, most of the member states are currently preparing themselves to participate in the MRA on PF, and based on the latest information received, we are expecting AMS to submit their readiness to participate in MRA by end of this year. And other than that, as we know that MRA is intended to be a multilateral arrangement in which all member states are required to participate. However, any member state which is not ready to fully implement this MRA may withhold their participation, not exceeding withholding period of 5 years after the entry of force of this MRA. And just to share with you the progress of the implementation, this JSC MRA on PF have appointed 21 panel of experts among the ASEAN member states to conduct evaluation of the member states' readiness to MRA on PF. And this panel of experts have completed all training sessions conducted in April and October 2022, with the aim for all appointed panel of experts to have the same understanding on obligation and principle of MRA on PF, as well as the process to conduct evaluation, both document and on-site evaluation of the AMS food safety system. And previously also, JSC MRA on PF, we have also developed the standard operating procedure on the implementation of this MRA. Based on the principle explained in the sectoral MRA on PF. And this SOP will provide guidance to the panel of experts in conducting the evaluation process. This is the one that I would like to share, the step that has been taken at the committee of the JSC at the ASEAN level. Back to you.
Thank you. Ms. Sorani, so for giving us that overview on where we are in terms of the readiness of the countries. So that is very interesting to note that countries are already undertaking their gap analysis, that countries have the option to stay out of the arrangement for 5 years while they are getting ready for it. And there's an expert panel of 21 members who's supporting countries both with capacity development and also with analyzing their gaps. So in a way, from the point of view of the regulator, a lot of preparatory work is ongoing. So Mr. Lokman, if I may ask you then, from the point of view of the industry, what is the state of readiness in meeting the standards from requirements as they are laid out in the MRA? And in particular with reference to the general principles of food hygiene of ASEAN, because that's essentially the key area always, particularly in the Asia Pacific. So what would be the the perspective of the industry in your view. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sridhar. Okay, thank you, the Puan Nurani, for your mentioning about the technical assistance 2 times in this year, so in April and October, if I'm not wrong. But we understand that the implementation of MRAs, maybe it's not a problem for the medium big companies, but for the small medium enterprises, this is we still have a gap in the implementations. As we know, the SMEs is including a micro enterprises are integral to the economic development and growth in ASEAN member states. So they constitute the largest number of establishments and contribute significantly to the labor force of Asian member states. So we realize that there are still many SMEs that are left behind. So this is the big problems and the big gap to be overcome. So the lack of knowledge and understanding of food safety standard, lack of information due to the limited access, lack of access to appropriate resources, including lack of market access. And of course, many of lacking in the working capital. So we need to work hard for the, helping our member from the small medium enterprises, including micro enterprises. So what we have to do is, I think, governments need to carry out more intensive guidance and rather than law enforcement. This is very important. Not only training or capacity building, but also we need to help them for coaching, for guiding them to implement the MRA to trade among the ASEAN countries. And also maybe we need to help them with a close loop collaboration with the big enterprises. So that's why they can make a collaborations among the SMEs with the medium big companies to work together and develop their skill, their capability for implementing the MRA. And of course, we need to help them with the market access. So this.
Sorry, I believe we have another connectivity issue. Maybe just give it a minute.
No, I'm here. I actually thought we lost Mr. Lukman towards the end. But anyway, we'll just continue. So if I may just come back to you, Ms. Norani. So would you like to respond to some of the comments made by Mr. Lukman, especially on addressing the gaps, particularly with the SMEs and the MSMEs who have far less capacity? But then the countries in the region, particularly like Malaysia and even Indonesia, have programs on building and improving, especially good hygiene practices among the players who are on the smaller players. So would that be one way to go as to help the industry in addressing these gaps while the MRA starts rolling into the ASEAN bloc? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shada. I think as we know that the objective of this sectoral MRA is more on the mutual recognition on the inspection and certification system of the food hygiene with regards to the production, import, and export of the prepared food stuff. And I think we do take note that there are also capacity building that are needed, and also especially on the small medium enterprise among the ASEAN member states. And I think it's very important, and we are encouraging all the AMS to engage at their national level to ensure the medium enterprise is also can reduce the gap of the implementation of this MRA. So one of the ways, in my view, in order to understanding to bridge the gap in the food safety across the parties, is to understand the principle in the food control as one of the main components that should be addressed. And I think capacity building might be also required for this purpose in ensuring all parties are able to fulfill the MRA on the PF requirement. So I think we are also encouraging that the contact point at every AMS just to ensure the full implementation and the success of the implementation of MRA, that they will engage closely with the industry or the food business operator in their own country. And the other way also, this gap can also be bridged through the harmonization of some control measure, and maybe and also to member state can also request cooperation in the technical assistance on the building up of the maintaining the technical competence of inspection and certification system of hygiene of the prepared food stuff product in their country, and also maybe identify what are the other capacity building that are needed for their country. Over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Noraini. So, Mr. Lukman, do you agree with that, or any other comment you want to make on this before we move on to the next topic?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I agree with Puan Noraini. And maybe more important is each member countries maybe can establish like a permanent technical assistance for SMEs, especially to help them for the implementing this MRA. This is very important. ASEAN, as all the ASEAN member states to establish this permanent technical assistance committee, I think is very important. Do you agree, Dr. Noraini?
Thank you. So, yeah, go ahead, Ms. Nixon.
Those are a few options that we can explore, but currently when we are looking at this MRA under the JSC, which is the platform where is part of the platform that can discuss in terms of the implementation of the AMS on the MRA. But when we want to go beyond, focusing on the requirement or just to ensure that the implementation of the MRA will go smoothly. So I think those are something that we can explore. But currently under the JSC, which is the objective of JSC is to ensure the implementation of this MRA is going to be implemented smoothly. And as we know that, as I highlighted earlier, that because of the different gaps, so every AMS have the obligation to ensure that their food control system can meet the requirement as what required under the MRA and in annexes.
Okay, thank you. And I think we encourage all member states to do more disseminations and to do more dissemination for, especially for the SMEs to make them understand about the MRA and how to do for the food trade among the ASEAN countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lukman. Thank you, Ms. Noraini. So I think this has been a fascinating discussion so far. I think we are all learning a lot as we hear from both of you. So just coming towards the end of the discussion, if may I ask both of you, first to Ms. Noraini and then to Mr. Lukman. So as the implementation plan is being worked out for the MRA, so from both directions, so from the point of view of ASEAN and the regulators, what would be the major milestones that you would be looking out for? And likewise, from the point of view of industry, if I can ask, what are the major milestones or key things you would like to achieve in the next few years so that this can be implemented smoothly. So if I can start with Ms. Noorani first.
I think as the current chair of the JIC MRA on PF, I see that implementation of MRA on PF in ASEAN will provide an enhanced means of assuring that imported product conform to the agreed requirement with regard to food hygiene, and this will result in mutual confidence between all parties as evaluation for its conformance will be conducted to ensuring that the MRA requirement can be met. And beside that, also that this MRA could also benefit competent authority in eliminating duplication of activities between the exporting and importing authorities, especially in low-risk product, and thus we could use collective resources more efficiently and effectively. And for example, such MRA may result in reducing the importing country rate and physical check for sampling to test against standard or to avoid additional certification in the country of origin. At the same time, in my view, that MRA could also provide a mechanism for the cooperative exchange of expertise, assistance, and information among the member states to help assure and enhance conformity of the other parties with the set of requirements. And when we look at the MRA in the holistic manner, we could say that MRA is not generally intended as the condition for trade, but rather as a mean for multilateral acceptance of measures that meet the appropriate level of sanitary or phytosanitary protection, and thereby accelerate border clearance, increase transparency, and ease of food trade in ASEAN. I think that is all my view from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lukman?
If we talk about the milestone, of course, we have to talk about what is the value and expectation of the MRA. MRA for the food and beverage industry, of course, to push the spirit for the food industry to do a more free flow of prepared foodstuff products, and also eliminating the technical barriers to trade and sanitary measures, and also to facilitate trade as well as protect the health of the consumers. This is the expectations. And at the end, we need to do more ease of doing business among the ASEAN member states. So the milestone is, I think, is the first in the short terms of the implementation of the MRA. We need to see the reducing of the NTMs. So we can measure what the NTMs are reducing after the implementations. Maybe this can be done by all ASEAN member states, all the countries to make a monitoring and also to report to the ASEAN member states that if this can be done, I think this is the success milestone of the MRA implementations. And then for the next step is helping the SMEs for more doing trade among the ASEAN countries and encourage them to do more fulfill the MRA implementations. Thank you, Dr. Sudha.
Thank you, Mr. Lukman and Ms. Noorani. So indeed, I mean, already the MRA itself is a milestone for ASEAN itself. And now as the implementation starts and countries starts get ready for that, there will be much more of quantitative analysis that needs to be done on the way that the implementation progresses. And as Mr. Lukman pointed out on how it is actually effective on the ground and the capacity building that's needed both for governments as well as for the private sector. So all that very well covered. And as we all know, food safety is an area where we keep improving all the time. There's no end to it, but it's about going forward. So we can see now, as we've heard from both our experts today, that ASEAN is now, and particularly in the area of prepared foods, is very well placed to move along this path. So On behalf of everyone who heard you, I'd like to thank both of you, Ms. Noorani, Mr. Lokman, for giving us not just a lot of information, but a lot of learning on how this is being implemented. And I think on behalf of FAO, it has been very informative to know what are the key areas in which we can continue to support our member countries in the region. And I just like to, on my own behalf, I just like to apologize for the connectivity issue. I mean, as you would all know, we are all entering a big holiday period. There's the New Year in many ASEAN countries. Of course, we already have the holy month of Ramadan, and then we have Easter coming up. So there's a huge pressure on the internet for bookings, I think. And so I've been unable to switch on my video, but I thank you very much. And I thank you again, AFBA, for organizing this very informative session. And I pass it back to the organizers.
Thank you, Dr. Sridhar, and again, thank you to Puan Noorani and also Pak Adi Lokman for sharing at the panel discussion. So we're almost towards the end of our workshop for today, and right now I'll do a quick summary of what we have discussed so far. And in the meantime, my colleague will pop in the chat a link, which is to gather your feedback regarding today's session, and we'll appreciate your feedback so that we know how can we improve and what are some of the areas that we could take into consideration, even as we continue to look into organizing similar events in the future. So I think just to round up, today we heard from Ms. Tanya Martin from the Australia Import Control about the existing and available arrangement regarding import controls, and we saw how Australia has existing measures to lower rate of inspection and how it's based on a risk-based approach. And I think through her presentation, we can also appreciate that it's not an easy process, and it takes efforts from both the exporting and the importing countries to ensure equivalence. And even though like the process may be tedious or it take a lot of communication and efforts from both sides, but we can see how the benefits are significant in facilitating import and export activities. And regarding the joint food standards between Australia and New Zealand, we can also see how it's also it wasn't easy, but we could see how currently the existing framework does bring benefit for a free trade between both Australia and New Zealand. And moving into the panel discussion, we heard a lot about the current MRA on PF and how the annexes are consistent and adheres to the Codex text. And even as countries are going through that process of aligning and also doing their gap analysis, we recognize that countries are at different levels, and we recognize the needs for countries to coordinate efforts in their respective national levels to move towards that common goal. But we heard quite clearly about the commitment from ASEAN member states in achieving that. And I think for me, it's something new that I got to know that it's the first MRA in ASEAN on food safety. So I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that ASEAN member states are committing to this. And even though in terms of the scope, like we are looking at inspection and certification for food hygiene, but we know that it's definitely a milestone even as we look into like further alignment on food safety controls in the different ASEAN member states. Yep, and Mr. Adi Lokman also brought up a good point about the need to ensure that industry are ready as well, and bringing up a key stakeholder for the industry, which would be the SMEs, and how we could think about programs to assist this large group of enterprises that's within the ASEAN region. So I think just to close off, we heard a lot about how these the benefits as well as the gaps, but I think without a doubt we can recognize that the benefits would outweigh and it really highlights the need to push through the different hurdles that we may have. And for AFBA, I think just to close off, we recognize that there would still be a lot of work to be done, and we really appreciate PFEWG's willingness to engage with us, and from industry side, we remain open to see if there's any other ways to collaborate, be it at a regional or in-country level. So with that, I would like to thank all our participants today for joining us this afternoon, and we wish you a pleasant afternoon ahead, and we hope to see you again. Yeah. Thank you very much.